Terrific. Well, I'm sure you'll all agree that was rather wonderful. Right. We have this woman in the front row here.
To Ruth, you said that it's only the chimps that... Sorry, got chimps on the brain now. The Tibetans that have the gene to live above 4,000 metres. Okay. How then do you explain the people in La Paz in Bolivia who are living at similar heights? And even with research there, they've been amazed that the women, of course, can even reproduce at such a height as well.
Well, okay, I have to admit I don't know their status, but it's a reasonably recent discovery that they have discovered that there is an adaptation in in a gene that's in the part of the genome that is to do with respiratory function that has been identified in Tibet. And interestingly enough, they have identified it or something that looks not dissimilar. It's not the same gene, but something that gives a similar adaptation, which is actually a faster rate of breathing. In their dogs as well, who are also living at such a high area. So this is something that's changed from the populations from which they came, and so the Chinese living at lower altitude don't have this. So I have to admit that I don't know whether they've looked yet in the high altitude
you
populations.
Predict that if we went and looked, we might find...
The interesting thing, so I do know, so for example, in the lactose gene that people have been looking at for much longer, it is actually quite interesting because that particular gene that I showed you the map of is 100% successful at predicting lactose tolerance in Europeans, but actually in some African populations, it's a slightly different gene that's caused the exact same effect. So if you like, natural selection has found
parallel solutions.
Two different ways. I mean, there's still sort of genes to do with regulating roughly the same kind of metabolic process, but the actual mutation is different, showing that it's independently evolved in just slightly different ways, but it works in several different populations. So I could imagine, given that you've got different populations that are not necessarily evolved from each other, but evolved from lowland populations moving up high, it might be possible that we've seen the same thing. But I honestly don't know whether they've looked yet. They may well have done. I was just giving one example.
Thank you. That's a great question to start off with. We've got a whole new avenue of research to be done there. There was a gentleman just behind there who had a question.
Ruth, you mentioned the longevity of the high-altitude Tibetans. Mm-hmm. Is there any research yet on the Chinese that are overrunning Tibet? Are they adapting quickly or not? Are they dying off more rapidly than the indigenous Tibetans?
Well, I only have anecdotal evidence that non-Tibetans living in those parts of Tibet actually do find it difficult, and they actually don't necessarily feel that well most of the time. So, people do, this is purely anecdotal, having been up there a little bit last year, people do say that they actually, can't quite cope with it. Of course, not all of Tibet is necessarily that high, but most of the Tibetan plateau is pretty high, and there's certainly anecdotal evidence that people do find it quite difficult if they don't have this genetic adaptation.
I mean, you've been up there, Ruth. It must be pretty bad. I mean, what's it like?
Well, I've been up there for short periods of time, and it's like you forget. I remember once someone was taking a photograph, and I was somewhere else, and they said, "Oh, come and join this photograph," and I ran to catch up with them. And everyone was like, "No, don't run." And I thought, I'm in a minefield or something. And they were just worried that I was just going to polax, because you just literally do run out of oxygen. It is quite interesting. Yeah. But you see people playing baseball and running around and absolutely fine.
No, so I was interested when you mentioned the density of populations being very important for this cultural transmission, and wondered whether Andy had anything to say about that with respect to chimpanzees. Do you get more cultures, more of these 39 identified cultures appearing in higher density populations?
I don't think so. I think, what Ruth's really talking about there is the sort of acceleration in cumulative culture, I think, in the human case, which is, in terms of even human evolution, it's a relatively sort of recent development. And I think if we go back into sort of early human evolution, I don't know, into the Stone Age, the early Stone Age, cultural change was extremely slow then. I mean, that the first sort of major transition in stone tools was from the very sort of primitive Oldowan tools, which just have a few chips knocked off, to these lovely symmetrical Acheulean blades, pear-shaped blades. I'm sure you've all seen. But that hardly changed for about a million years. So, I mean, it was a long time before the cumulative cultural change started, and at that point you can detect, or there's evidence of these changes in population.
But I mean, it raises the interesting possibility that because great apes, for example, do live at pretty low population densities, so it does raise, if you want to do a sort of mind game into a Planet of the Apes type film or something like that. I mean, it does, because I think one of the interesting points that came out of this paper is that, there have been obviously temptations in the past to describe some of these human differences between populations in cultural complexity as, could it be, could there be differences in ability between human populations and things like that? And it's quite possible that it's literally just population density. Some of these traditions can't take off in low density areas, and maybe the primates have just never had a high enough density population for long enough to do anything very spectacular.
Might we lose chimp cultures as the density goes down? I mean, does that sound plausible?
I think we're losing chimpanzee cultures already, as it were, as communities are being compressed and then going extinct, which is a kind of analogous situation, I suppose, to human small language groups, in places like New Guinea and South America, where there have been hundreds of tiny local language groups, and they're dying out through similar kind of processes. And I think the same thing is happening with chimpanzee cultures. So we're not just losing chimpanzees, which we're also doing. We're also losing the great apes, but the local cultures will be dying out as well. But I was going to say, if I could just add one thing to the notion of, what restricts cultural transmission in animals like the great apes. One thing might be the density, but there's a number of other factors as well. And one is who you copy. And we all know in the human case, there's a tendency, for example, to copy high status individuals, or if David Beckham cuts his hair one way, then suddenly, there's a load of young men out there just doing the same. We're very prone to that kind of effect, and we found the same thing in chimpanzees. So if a high-ranking individual starts doing something, others are more likely to do that. However, what happens in nature is that the individuals who move between groups tend to be females who have a low status when they arrive, and so although they may know some new trick like nut cracking, it may be that no one really attends too much to what they're doing, and there's a lot of innovations that have been recorded in chimpanzees, but they've not spread. They're, as it were, stillborn. There's that kind of limitation as well.
Hi, this is to Gaia on the right. I know this might be very vague, but would you say you are, given everything you've seen in your book and what you spoke about, would you say you're optimistic for the future or not?
Well, I feel like you have to be optimistic because there's really not much point in not being optimistic. But But I mean, so just talking just now about the, it's a mixture. You know, you can't say everything's great, everything's bad. So we're just talking about culture and so on. So this move to urbanization is accelerating innovation and innovative culture. But at the same time, we're also undergoing this global homogenization of culture. So everywhere you go, you see almost the same goods being sold, the same music, the same. You used to be able to travel around the globe and really hear differences. Now, you can get pretty much everywhere with a couple of languages. So we're seeing this extraordinary homogenization and this loss, I think, of difference. But at the same time, we're also seeing this much more rapid change in everything, in every sphere of culture. I think we're innovating extremely fast because changes are getting sped around the globe so much quicker, and people can access them and input their own additions to what we're doing. And that's hopeful for the environment. It's hopeful for conservation practice. We now know what's going on. We can see, you know, we have satellite images everywhere. We can zoom in on a single leaf in the Amazon and see how it's photosynthesizing, never mind whether it's being chopped down, you know. So I think we have a lot more knowledge, and that empowers us, and it gives us choices which we might not have had before. You know, yes, I'm optimistic.
But things will be okay when humans have gone, right?
Well, I mean, people say, "Oh, do you think, you know, it's the end of the earth?" It's not the end of the earth. It just might be the end of us. Or what I think, when I'm being pessimistic, it's not about even the extinction of our species. It's just about the enormous numbers already living in poverty, living in the same situation as other people get rich, and then that is the tragedy, because we can, you know, essentially all we are is a biochemical robot that consumes certain chemicals and spurts out others. There's plenty of 10 billion of us can live easily. It's just whether we can live in comfort, you know, and with what we want, and that's what we need to work out.
I was very interested about how there was an explosion in culture with increased population density. At what point, and what was the significance of when the ability to record information came in other words, the use of symbols, so that knowledge could be built upon that? And not just on a basis of population density.
I mean, that's very recent, but you know, that's an interesting point about you know, acceleration, because obviously once you start being able to you know, I mean, I think Andy already talked about how it all sort of started off rather slowly, and like a lot of these processes, you can imagine it being a sort of exponential curve that once it starts building, and that. I mean, I don't know, when did writing start? I mean, it's only literally in the last, hundreds.
But then printing and then the internet is hugely enabling.
And that would have been sort of very few individuals would ever really have made any use of it until it became, you know, literally in then books and whatever. Just in the last few hundred, if that, and then internet is obviously another. You know, it takes off again, and you can imagine it's completely sort of changed the way we teach our children and what we value, and you know, going back to this gene culture coevolution, you can imagine suddenly a whole load of new cognitive skills that weren't useful at all in our very recent history are suddenly incredibly useful and get you all sorts of important jobs and all kinds of things. So you can imagine that that's changing everything, you know, extremely fast. It might not be helping with any of the
it is, of course it is. And the difference is that instead of it just being one or two people in a society that can contribute to the knowledge and actually write down and have the decision, the one person who speaks Latin in the village or whatever, it's all of us. We can all do it. Children are programming. They're coming up with new ways of thinking about things that they write down, and somebody else living in another part of the globe can then read and add to. And so, I mean, it's extraordinarily fast.
Even just in the last probably 10 years or so, like scientific papers were largely within the confines of universities that
we have got open access now.
That could afford all the journals, and now you can download. There's now almost everything we publish now has to be openly available on the internet. So suddenly, the whole world can read papers about how to become a heart surgeon or whatever it is they want to learn.
I want to be able to take a couple more questions before we have to wrap up. There's one. You got one up there? No. Just down at the front here. Sorry, Deborah. Down this gentleman in the white shirt, and then one up there.
Andy, when they did the experiment with the chimp children and the human children on the artificial fruit. Did anyone ask the children why they copied everything, even though it wasn't necessary?
It has been done. Children of the age that we were testing were sort of about 3 and 4 years old. I mean, you can ask them those kind of questions, and generally you don't get much sense from it, So they will tend to say something, but it doesn't generally sort of help understand why they're doing it. What has been done is to really see if you can change this over-imitation tendency by actually sort of asking them not to copy any silly things that you happen to see done, and really sort of tell them not to. And the results of that was that they still did it. So it was concluded that it's really almost like an automatic process that you can't kind of reason through. And as I said, we did it with 3 and 4 year olds to begin with. And our first question was, when do children grow out of this sort of silliness? And so we did it with older children and found they did it even more. And now we've done it with adults, and because most of us here are adults, do it even more actually. So I've now come round to the view that so you can ask me, well, why do I do it? And I think probably the answer is that the one I gave, really, it's a sort of a rule of thumb. You see someone intentionally doing this this kind of action, even though it doesn't make some sense. It's a good rule of thumb to copy what they do.
Brilliant. That maybe explains how we've accelerated our cultural so rapidly. Gentleman here, then possibly one over here.
Thank you very much. We've talked a lot about cultural transmission. I was just wondering to anyone, but perhaps Ruth, whether you could say something perhaps on memes, and whether actually talking about cultural mistakes in terms of cultural transmission and memes as a method of that transmission, maybe as an explanation for cultural mistakes, in inverted commas, becoming sort of in societies. Thank you.
I don't know. Well, I mean, as I said, I did give some examples just at the very end of my talk, and probably the word meme is used a little bit less than it was, just because I mean, I know it's deliberately trying to sound like the word gene, but just by trying to sound like the word gene, it caused some confusions in the debate. So I think people have now just been talking about like cultural variation or cultural traits. I think there's a big debate in things like why we have so few children is an interesting area, because that doesn't seem to make any sense in terms of natural selection, but in terms of the idea that we're promoting educational values or intense investment in a small number of children does seem to be a fairly plausible explanation for why we're, you might call that a cultural mistake if by mistake you mean something that doesn't necessarily promote the spread of our genes. So I think that might be one of the examples of what you're talking about. I mean, one of the other examples, I guess, something like religion, I'm not at all convinced that that's necessarily a maladaptive thing at all. I think that might be a cultural adaptation. That it's actually it's very, very widely spread, and it might just be that, societies that have strong cohesive beliefs and this kind of thing actually are, it's actually quite a useful thing to have on your side, as it were. So perhaps it's not an evolutionary puzzle at all. So I think it's case by case, really. I think, a lot of studies are now being done on these kind of evolutionary puzzles because they are perhaps the interesting questions. We understand quite a lot about how natural selection works and on animal behavior, and are humans different, and to what extent? The
term meme was coined, was it not, by Richard Dawkins?
Yeah.
And his sort of classic example of it was, that was written, I guess, in the 1980s, was wearing a baseball cap backwards, and that this idea seemed to spread through human populations, and it did. But I think that meme's essentially gone extinct, right? Now, I think we're beyond that one.
Thank you. Is there any evidence that chimpanzees learn to cook? And if not, what significance might that have had in human evolution?
Well, there's been a lot of work on cookery, significance of cookery in human evolution. There's a book by Richard Wrangham, with a W Wrangham, all about that, and I think that's quite compelling. Chimpanzees, I mean, in the wild, haven't got anywhere near that, but we know that they have a capacity, the kind of social learning capacity I mentioned means that if they're faced with the innovation, then they can pick it up. There's a bonobo called Kanzi. Some of you may have. He's quite a famous bonobo, a subject studied by Sue Savage-Rumbaugh in these kind of language learning experiments in the States, and she takes him out on picnics, and there are some wonderful videos. You can probably see that on YouTube of him going out on the picnic. And they do a barbecue. I mean, he knows how to light a fire, put the pan on, get the sausages on. I mean, he's learned by observation all of that. So I think that suggests that chimpanzees have this remarkable social learning ability, but they don't have the capacity to actually invent these things, and they haven't invented that. They haven't invented fire.
Do we know if he likes? Do we know if he likes the barbecue sausage?
He loves it. They're moderately carnivorous chimpanzees.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But in the wild situation, I was just thinking, sort of bushfires. Presumably, they respond to that in a very kind of runaway sort of. They don't go through it afterwards looking for a bit of roasted galago or something.
That's right. I mean, it's interesting. How did that first happen? I suppose it could have been that. I mean, there's a lot of volcanic activity in East Africa in the kind of rift when early human evolution was going on. There was a lot of fire activity there, and there was a lot of hunting big game hunting starting to become more and more common, and there may have been just chance occurrences there of the crossing over of those two things, so that things got cooked, and then there's the social learning ability there, the observational learning ability there to recognize, that's something I can recreate. That's a speculation.
Brilliant. And on that note, I'd like everybody to thank again our speakers this evening.